Well, today I have Allison Ball with me, Allie, as she goes by. Allie is the founder and CEO of Food Biz Wiz and the creator of Retail Ready, which is an online program for providing strategic support and curated curriculum for food producers. In a nutshell, she helps young food companies get listed in stores, which is a super hard thing to do. And so we're definitely interested to learn more about how you do that and how you got here. So maybe you just want to introduce yourself first and kind of tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are and what you're doing.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm also excited for this conversation. So my name's Allie. I live in San Francisco. I am a former wholesale buyer turned retail consultant. So my background was as a grocery buyer. I spent ages working in a specialty food market here in San Francisco, figuring out what products we were going to carry on our shelves, where we were going to merchandise them, how we could make enough margin off of them, and how we could get our shoppers to put them in their baskets time and time again. And I found that over and over again, we would have these wonderful products, these local products, these values aligned products, these delicious products, and they wouldn't work on our retail shelves. And Daniel, it was heartbreaking to see these producers who put so much time, so much energy, so much money into their startups and not be able to figure out what that key piece was for sustained success. So I did that for a long time. I loved working directly with producers. And then my role changed a bit. We opened another market and I moved away from that grocery buyer position. And I moved into the position of head of grocery and retail store manager. And with that, my responsibilities shifted. I became solely focused on the P&L of a multi-million-dollar department, trying to figure out how the heck we were going to hit our financial goals. And with that, it was a great education, right? Wonderful, wonderful skill set to know how to analyze a P&L. Yeah. But I really missed working with producers. And I realized that in a way, it felt like my impact in our industry was becoming smaller. Mm-hmm. And I realized that if I actually wanted to help on the producer level, on the brand level, I needed to leave my role of grocery buyer, my role of head of grocery, and work directly with the producers. So I left.
Sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
At what time was that?
Yeah.
Like what year was that happening?
Yeah. So back when I was at that original location, I call it the glory days of retail. Yeah. It was like 2008, 2009, 2010. And especially in San Francisco, this was really when specialty food was skyrocketing.
Yeah, I was just about to say, like, if you saw changes during that time. Yeah. So.
We did, we were, back then, I think, back to a recession in those years and thinking about consumer behavior, almost, not unlike the pandemic, we saw so many people cooking at home more and spending money on specialty products instead of going out to fine dining or expensive vacations or, whatever that was. So we really found that there was an eager consumer. Right. And they were really, and all of a sudden, a $10 chocolate bar didn't seem like so much of an indulgence compared to the $150 dinner. Right. Yep. And so it's really interesting. And we saw some of that pattern repeat during pandemic, which I'm happy to speak about. Okay. But, so that was, 2008, 2009, 2010, I opened that second store. We finally opened in 2013. It took us years to open. And then I left that role in 2014, so 9 years ago, and started my business.
So really good timing, actually, for like the indie food world, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it was Buy Right Market, the family of businesses that I worked for. And at that time, so Buy Right's been around since 1940. It has really changed, obviously changed a lot since the early days. But in the early 2000s, the sons took it over from the older generation. And Sam, actually, who was trained as a chef in Switzerland, came back to the States and said, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it my way. And I'm going to put in a prepared foods counter. I'm really going to focus on specialty. And Sam, and then Byright really became leaders in the specialty food movement in the United States. And so we found that we were able to spark conversation, and we were able to really influence a national conversation about what it meant to eat local, what it meant to buy sustainably, what it meant to know where your meat was coming from. All of that was really, really exciting. And that's why I call it the glory days, the glory days of retail.
Yeah, I think also, San Francisco is usually leading in many of those things. But yeah, it was right about the same time that I became more aware of the food industry as well myself. And I think that this like proliferation of brands and proliferation of products has in a way been helped by not only interest in them from the consumers, but also many of these platforms like Facebook and like Shopify and all these different ways in which you can sort of get established without having to go through this retail channel. But still, the retail channel, and we see this in almost all the research we do with consumers, it's the holy grail. Like if you get into retail, it makes all the difference in having a versus having like a small little company that a few people buy your product and having like real distribution.
Yeah. And this is what I saw. I saw that brands would jump to retail and not be ready for it, because retail is a whole other beast, right? And it's one thing to sell your product direct to consumer. And, we do see brands who do that really, really well. It's usually brands who have a lot of money, have the budget to hire someone on the digital marketing side, who have that skill set to connect with their consumers over the internet. So we often see brands like start with direct to consumer, or like dipping their toes over there, and they're like, okay, I'm ready for retail. And once they try to get on those shelves, they realize that retail is slow. It's still like a very, very slow channel in terms of getting on the shelf and getting those reorders and convincing that buyer to place the first purchase order. And getting on the shelf is just the first step. Once you get on the shelf, I don't want to say that's when the real work begins, but that's when a large portion of the work begins. And again, getting in those shoppers' baskets.
So anyway, you left this role.
I left Byright. I left Byright.
And then I understand you had a bit of a transition to get to where you are now. So that's what
I did. Yeah, I absolutely did. So when I left Byright, I realized two things. One, I wanted to work with other retailers across the country. I realized that, again, San Francisco is a bubble. Byright was in a bubble. And I knew that in order to expand my experience and be able to like really address what was going on in our industry, I had to work outside of my bubble. So I worked with retailers across the country, helping develop grocery buying practices, inventory management practices, merchandising, category reviews, things like that. And really got to, it was eye-opening, really got to see the variety of retailers out there and how some are really organized and really in support of small brands and wanting to become partners, and others are disorganized. Others are, heads down about the bottom line, and that's all that matters. And it was really, really interesting to see that difference. So I did that for a while growing my one-on-one consulting with brands. And, honestly, like the retail stuff is what paid the bills at first, right? I needed that cash flow in order to build up that one-on-one client base. And slowly that started growing, that one-on-one work. And after a couple years, maybe 2 years or so, I realized that the vast majority of my one-on-one clients got stuck at the same exact spots in their retail strategy. There are just universal things that it seemed like there were universal things that brands did not know. Yeah. And it felt like small brands didn't really have much of a budget for one-on-one consulting, or didn't even realize that that was a thing when they were making their budgets, right? Think about being a small business and not knowing what resources
I think
are
there's just
out
so
there
much
for
you
you.
don't know when you start
You
a
don't
business, right?
know.
Like there's just
You
so
don't
you don't
know.
even know what you don't know. And if you stop to think about what you don't know, you probably get discouraged. So
You'd probably pause. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, and I've done it in my own business, right? Like here I am in year 9, but in year 1, I was just winging it. I didn't know what I was doing. And like that blind trust, that confidence that I was going to figure it out is what got me to year 9, right?
Yeah.
So I found that these brands didn't really have a budget for one-on-one. They all were getting stuck at the same spot. They all felt really lonely in our industry. And I saw so much, gosh, I hate to use this word, but it's almost like imposter syndrome. So many folks, especially in the Bay Area, were coming out of another career where they were really successful. I worked with so many people who frankly like came out of tech where they were really, really successful.
Mountain, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then they come to our food industry and they're like, oh my goodness, like why? Like I'm smart, I'm capable, I am successful in this other career. Why the heck can't I figure it out in our food industry?
It was a huge shock to me too. Like I came from tech, and I had a couple of guys that I worked with who were from the food industry, and they used to call it food speed because I was like, look, in tech, if you don't act by the end of the week, you're finished, right?
Yes.
And food, it just doesn't. It's so slow. It takes months, years.
Oh, man. Ages. We have clients who, their ultimate goal is, say, like to get into Target or to get into Walmart or even like Kroger. So these bigger national stores, and it can take a year, 14 months, 18 months. And the challenge here, Daniel, is that unless you are really savvy and unless you anticipate how long it's going to take, you're going to run out of cash. Right. That's just the nature of the business.
You've got all these capital costs. And then what I observe with smaller brand startups is that at some point they just have to jump off the cliff. Like they can't stop to think about what they're doing, because if they stop too long, they're dead. And if they might as well take the plunge, basically.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think that a lot of them have this fatalistic attitude of just like, I'm just going to go for it and believe in myself, which is why I think what you're doing is so cool, is that you're trying to sort of catch them in a way that they can digest a little bit more knowledge to hopefully be, I guess, a little bit more probable of success. I mean, of course,
exactly. And so, I realize this is a long introduction about me and how I got to where I am now. But, with those realizations about working with small brands, I knew there had to be a better way than one-on-one consulting. And at this point, my calendar was filled, right? I could not take on any more clients. And so I had this idea. This was back in 2015. I was like, what if I just put these folks together and we did like cohort style consulting? This is back when I didn't even know what an online course was. I didn't know, like, there wasn't this digital course industry out there, but I just had this hunch that I could work with people all over the country and put them in an online cohort and take them through my one-on-one work just in a small group setting. And that was the first version of Retail Ready. And we launched it in early 2016. So wild. We've now had, this, over 2,500 brands go through our program. And it's all about figuring out your systems for getting on the retail shelf and for selling through once you're there. Yeah. So systems are my superpower. I am a systems person through and through. And one of the challenges that I would see with these small brands is that they didn't know how to speak the language of wholesale. They didn't know what that buyer meant when they were asking if you could do, a BOGO or a free fill. They didn't know how to follow up with buyers. They didn't know how to systematize any of this process so that they could streamline their sales process and their business.
Yeah. I'm going to make you define what a BOGO is.
Yeah. Okay. So BOGO. Yeah,
just,
great
just
question.
as an aside.
Yeah, of course. Because some people listening are like, oh, shoot, she got me. Like, I don't know what that is. Okay. A BOGO is buy one, get one, BOGO. And that is simply a type of sales promotion that you can do in retail. And what's really interesting, I'm going to go off on a little tangent here, but what's really interesting is thinking about the types of promotions that you can do in retail. Yep. And how they align with your goals. So often, and this is one of the mistakes that I see brands make, is that wholesale buyer wants you to do some sort of promotion, right? Of course, like
they want you to pay something to promote.
They want you to pay something. They want you to put in a little effort to get your product off the shelf, right? And so there are all different ways that you can do that. But if you're a new brand and you don't know the repercussions of saying yes to a BOGO rather than a free fill, which is literally where you give a free case of product for the shelf, you can really run into problems down the line, right? Again, cash flow problems. You can run into inventory problems. You can run into problems with your distributor doing chargebacks, or simply you might not hit your goal of doing the promotion.
So it sounds like there's a lot of little micro negotiations where you have to know your position, their position, which is right.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, even in this example, like I would do if I were a new brand launching onto the shelf, the goal is we call it drive trial, right? You want to get new customers to try your product. Okay. And how are you going to do that? A new brand might think, okay, I'm going to do a buy one, get one, because that's going to move more product, right? But I'm going to push back and say, well, if someone's never tried your product before, why would they want two of it? Right? Like that's a much bigger risk than doing 25% off or $1 off, right? So if I'm a savvy brand, I realize if the goal is to drive trial, I want to do a sale, a discount, rather than a BOGO, because I want to put my product in more baskets. However, if we are 1 year into a retail account and I see that my velocity, my sales are slowing down, I might do a BOGO because I want those numbers to look higher on the sales report when that buyer runs it, the next quarter, and they see like, oh, my velocity has actually increased this past quarter. So it depends on
the buyer doesn't see through that. The buyer doesn't interpret.
They know. And so I'll say two things. One, it depends, right? That buyer might be pulled in a million different directions, and ultimately, what they care about is velocity more than margin in that case, right? And it depends on the buyer's goals, right? Not all buyers care about the same things. They all care about financials, but it depends on the buyer's goal for that quarter and that category. Okay. So yeah, it depends. It depends on the buyer.
Okay. So I mean, great intro. Let's break it down then a little bit. So that you got this course. Yes. It sounds like it's a course, but it doesn't seem like each situation fits each company. So you probably got some follow-on work that you do. Maybe you can explain a little bit more about the program, how it's structured, what types of companies go to it. I mean, do you find like large established brands and things are also coming to you for
great question. Okay, so the way Retail Ready is structured is that there are three main components to it. We've got our curriculum that just lives on our course platform that is completely self-paced. So someone comes in, they dip their toes in, they fast forward to the lesson on sell sheets or on distribution, whatever they need. So we've got our curriculum. We've got our community. That is everyone who is in Retail Ready is put in our private community where they can ask each other questions. They can do collaborations. They can get support from me and my team, 24/7, Monday through Friday, I should say. And then we've got our live calls. Twice a month, we do live calls where anyone can submit a question. We get on Zoom and we go back and forth for 90 minutes doing what I call like one-on-one consulting just in front of a group. Right. And so I really love those because we find that even if people don't submit questions, if they attend the call and they're just listening to it in the background or whatever that is, they have aha moments for their own brand. So it's those three things that are really important. It's the curriculum, it's the community, and the calls that make up Retail Ready. From there, we have broken down our Retail Ready framework into 3 stages: attract, pitch, and grow. The attract stage is all about figuring out your channel strategy. So who the heck you are selling your product to, what channels are they looking to buy your product in, and what is most profitable for your brand. Again, we've talked about this. It all goes back to cash flow. We need to get you on that path to profitability as quickly as possible. And that really happens when we take the time to define a channel strategy. So that's the attract stage. The pitch stage is all about speaking that language of the wholesale buyer. So how are you going to pitch to them? Getting your pitch templates in place so you're not reinventing the wheel every time you go to pick up the phone or send that sales email. We figure out the process for following up with a buyer, making sure that once you send that initial email or once you've called 3 times that you don't get discouraged and just let it fade away. Yeah. We make sure that you've got that streamlined process for all of the touch points and the follow-up. And then grow is all about strategic growth steps, strategic partnerships, strategic marketing to make sure that, again, once you're on that shelf, you actually sell off of it. So that is in-person marketing, demos, trade show strategies, things like that. Digital marketing, all about making sure that your online presence works. Yep. And then figuring out whether or not it is right for you to work with brokers and distributors. So I think one of the challenges is that brands, we hear this message that there's one path to success. Right? Yeah. Make a product for as cheap as possible, get a co-packer to produce it for you, raise some investment because you're not going to pay yourself for a couple of years, and then find a broker and a distributor to get you as widely distributed as possible.
Just add water, everything
right, works, exactly. Right? Yeah. Ta-da! And I think that that's not true. I think that there is a better way to do it. I think it works for some brands, but I don't think that is the only way for success. So that third step of the retail,
numerically, go ahead. Never work. Sorry, like that. Yeah. If everybody follows that, then
how's it going to work?
There's just not enough space for all of them, so it can't be. Yeah. So.
There's not enough space. There's not enough investment in our industry. There's not enough physical shelf space. Yeah, it doesn't work, right? And when you just follow those steps, you're blindly following someone else's strategy. Right. And who's to say that's going to work for your own business? So that third step, the grow phase of Retail Ready, is all about making those strategic decisions that work for your own brand, figuring out, when is it right to hire a broker? When would I hire an internal sales rep instead of a broker? When might I decide that a co-packer is the next step for my brand? When might I do distribution, or is self-distribution the way to go for me? So all about thinking about those, what happens next so that you can get off the shelf once you're there. Yeah. So those are the 3 stages, right? Attract, pitch, and grow. And we find that Retail Ready attracts 2 different audiences. It either attracts the early stage brand who is having some success in retail, but is getting frustrated at how slow it's going, or how slow the reorders are coming in, right? They're like, okay, my product, people love my product. I can sell it well enough, but it is just sitting on the shelf. Right. And if it just sits on the shelf, it's going to get discontinued. Yeah. So that brand who's having some success in retail, usually they're in year 1, 2, 3 or so. Or what's really interesting is that we have brands who are in year 10, 20, 50, who are like, okay, what we used to do in retail is no longer working. Yeah. Or what we're big enough now that we've got many, many sales reps and they need support.
Right.
to land new accounts and get those reorders. And we don't have the capacity or frankly, the desire to support them in this current climate. So they send them through Retail Ready so that we essentially do the hand holding of
like
the sales reps.
That seems like a total no-brainer.
It's cool.
It is
it's cool to see both.
You're getting me
it's
interested
really,
in it now. So
it's really complicated. And I think it's so easy to get frustrated. Right. And it's so easy to think that it is us versus them, or like me versus them in our industry, right? If only the grocery buyer called me back, if only they gave me a better shelf space on the floor, if only they were more aware of pulling me out of backstock and actually putting me on the shelf when I sell through, right? There's so many ways that it can feel like a constant battle with those retail accounts. And so one of the big messages that we give inside of Retail Ready is that it is about partnerships, and we all have the same end goal. We all have the same end goal of higher sales. The brand wants higher sales, and the store wants higher sales. The broker, the distributor, we all want higher sales. And so how can we work together to make it happen?
Yeah. I mean, okay, so I'm going to ask you the $1 million question. In my mind is that there's only a certain number of people around that eat, right? Eat and drink.
Yes.
And there's only so much space in these physical shelves, right? And the big brand holders, the PepsiCos and the Mondelez of the world, they have a lot of power in that mix, right? So of course you want to help everybody. I mean, I think it's a great, fantastic concept you've got. But as you look at like the general industry going forward, you must see a lot more brands coming into the industry than you used to. Obviously, they're more well-equipped. The more well-equipped they get with services like yours and other capabilities, the more competitive the whole space gets. And so the more everything becomes just like on par with itself. So does this mean that we're going to end up having lots and lots of variety on the shelf, or that some of these companies will just fall out? Like, what do you think is going to be the future of our selection in terms of product variety and health, indulgence, like all those things, which are great for the consumer, but just hearing how competitive it is and how difficult it is to get into the store, you can imagine that it's really hard for these entrepreneurs to all succeed. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the $1 million question. And I'm going to be completely transparent here that I sometimes wonder, I sometimes wonder if I'm part of the problem, right? Because if we are giving Retail Ready students all of these tools to succeed on the shelf, it means the entrepreneurs who aren't coming through Retail Ready and who are really like trying their hardest and like bootstrapping and just like trying to do their best actually have less of a chance to get on the shelf.
That's life.
But that's life, right? Exactly. So thank you for that.
But that's also how you get, good products. Like if you ever travel to some other countries that are protective and don't have imports, for example, or not nearly as big as the US, and you see that actually the selection and quality of products and the price for those is not nearly what it is in countries where there's competition. So this is what drives, innovation, what drives better consumer selection. I think it's just a consequence of life, right?
Exactly. As I say this, I'm like, okay, well, that's a bigger question that I would unpack with my business coach, right? Like that's on me. That's not not industry wide.
But nevertheless, I think it is a situation that you didn't have in 1980, right?
Exactly.
You didn't have
exactly.
Right? So.
Yes, it was. Well, I think about some of the brands that I put on the shelf at Buy Right, even in 2010, and I'm like, they had, kind of crappy packaging.
Right.
They didn't have any budget for promotion. They had I'm thinking of one brand, I'm not going to say it, but like they had like a ditzy founder who was inconsistent in communication and ordering and dropping off and all of that. And I'm like, that just wouldn't fly in 2023. It doesn't, right? Because it has gotten more competitive. And, it's really interesting. I recently had a buyer from one of the like old stores that I worked with in New York reach out to me just a couple of weeks ago and was like, Allie, I can tell who has gone through Retail Ready and who hasn't. Like the quality of pitches, the quality of the sell sheet, the offers, the like offers to support the product on shelf is just of a different caliber.
Right.
So what's going to happen, right? Like what is going to happen to our shelves when we have these how would I call them? Retail ready products. As we have more and more retail ready products, what happens on the shelf? Sure. So I think that there's a few things that happens. One, big brands are getting nervous. Like
rightfully
these bigger
so,
companies are getting nervous. Yeah. So Expo West is the biggest trade show in the US and for natural products industry. And we have so many retail ready students who display at that show, who come back to our group afterwards and say like, the big brands were there scoping out my booth. They were taking pictures. They took my sell sheet. They were here like scoping my products.
But it's a lot harder for them to create, I think, the authenticity of the food or liquid. And it's also really hard for them to create the authenticity of the story.
Absolutely.
It's like just this localized nature of being able to go to your local supermarket and be able to buy something that was actually produced nearby, but not like far away. And I just think like the mega manufacturers are always going to be great at efficiency. Right.
Of course.
And they'll still be around, of course.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, my hope is that more of these companies can make a business. It's probably not going to be a huge business, but they can
That's exactly what I was going to say. So we see these bigger companies getting nervous, I think, or like taking inspiration from smaller brands. And I think the key here is figuring out for these smaller brands is figuring out what is the end goal of the business, right? Do I want to make $100,000 a year in this business and employ one other person and sell on, regionally in, all up and down the West Coast, or like whatever it is, right? And how am I going to do that? When I see brands who come to me and they say, I've got a single SKU, I've got a hot sauce brand, and I want to go national with it. And then I want to sell it to Heinz. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm like, okay, like I will help you with your sales materials, but just know that is, that's the 1 in a million, 1 in a billion shot versus, hey, let's be realistic. Let's make some goals that like feel really good for you and that feel achievable in where you want to go with this business. So I think, I don't want to I don't want to tell anyone that their end goal is not possible because we've seen brands get those big exits. We've seen brands. Gosh, we have one retail ready student who had a single SKU, a syrup company who built it to a multi-million-dollar a year brand with a single SKU. Whole Foods Global, right? Like it happens. Yeah. But we need to be realistic about what we want and what it's going to take to get us there. So my goal is my dream would be that when I'm shopping on the West Coast of the United States, I see different products than on the East Coast. And that when I go to the independent stores, I see different products than I see at Whole Foods. Or that even when I go to my gym, I see like really amazing juices and wellness shots and, functional granola bars and things like that I don't see on grocery store shelves. Yep. So I think there's a place for everyone? Yep. I think there's a place for everyone who is being smart about their strategy and really figuring out the channel that works for them.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. By the way, I like that whole world where you have unique products that are more localized. I think, by the way, it's also better for the environment. There's less travel. There's less.
100%. And actually, it's easier for the brand as well. It is so much easier to go really deep in your own backyard than it is to ship your products across the country and have no boots on the ground over there to support your product on the shelf. Right? Like so often we see the key thing, at least in the beginning, is to get on the retail shelves and then connect with your consumers once you're there, whether that's through demos, whether that's through staff education, whether that's through other like pop-up events where you're directing traffic back to that retail location. But it often involves a real person connecting at the store level. And that is so much easier when you can do it in your own region than across the country.
Right, exactly. And do you think retailers are becoming open to this and more aware of this? I mean, I would imagine that 15 years ago, they wanted to make big contracts with a lot of the big brands and then just distribute, because like retailers are essentially good at negotiating on price, right? Like they
that's the end goal, right?
Yeah. So the more that they have to do, because they have to basically do it in all these little localized sectors, that's more work for them, right? So
absolutely. Yeah. So I literally just found, I'm like, I wish I had it. It's across the room. I literally just found an old notebook of mine from 2010. And it was the page that I opened to was all about strategy for opening the second location, the second store that we were going to do, and how I was going to hit my margin goals in the category. And the last line, I literally took a picture of this and sent it out to my email list a couple of weeks ago that said, the last line said, the first price is never the last price. And this was, working in a single independent grocery store that really valued small producers. And I was being trained as a grocery buyer to negotiate on pricing regardless of who the brand is. So whether that small batch, like local coconut yogurt is pitching to me, or Chobani is pitching to me, I'm still going to negotiate on price. I understand as that grocery buyer that it's much less likely that the local small batch coconut yogurt brand is going to have much wiggle room. Right. But my job as a grocery buyer is to try. Right. I'm not doing my job unless I am trying to negotiate. Right.
The low margin business, basically.
It's a low margin business. Yeah, totally. I mean, so that store, the second store that we opened, we did $35 million in sales in year one of a store that was about 3,000 square feet. It is the highest grossing sales per square foot of any retail store in the United States.
Wow.
It's wild.
Wow.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Crazy.
Okay, I mean, like,
yes. Okay. And our margin, our profit margin was about 2%.
Yeah. That's so scary. Like as a business owner, it's just so scary. Yeah.
It was so scary. And, it's tough because then
your margin for error is like
your margin
very
for error
small.
Is so,
yes. You've got to
and
fight
I'll tell
for every
you,
penny, basically.
That first year, I'll tell you, I over ordered stuffing for Thanksgiving. So we had a commissary kitchen that really well known for the prepared foods, like I talked about. This was Sam's idea when he changed up by Thanksgiving was like the Super Bowl of retail for us. We would do $100,000 days, the leading up to Thanksgiving, and I over ordered on stuffing that first year that we were open for Thanksgiving. And we weren't profitable because of it. Because of one overorder.
Probably there are a few other things that happened too, but this is that one.
But like in that excuse me, I'll clarify. In that category, in the prepared foods category, I lost money because I miscalculated how much stuffing we were going to sell. And the stuffing has a short shelf life. It only had a couple of days on it. And we were like overloaded with that stuffing. And as a result, my prepared food category was not profitable the week of Thanksgiving.
Right. So are you, as a retail buyer, are you mostly interested in making sure that you sell out? Is that kind of what you like to see?
No, I mean, it's a really tricky balance because if we sell out, there's a couple challenges to it. That one, we don't know how much we could have potentially sold.
Yeah, that's a problem. Okay.
Right? Like you don't want a hole on the shelf. because that means you're not getting those sales.
Right.
Right.
You kind of need to have a little bit left over to know you know what your full capacity
Exactly.
is. Right?
Exactly. So you need a little bit left over. And what's really interesting about shopper behavior is that it's really hard to sell the last of something. And it's really challenging. Sales slow down when you have a shelf that looks more like barren, because people think it's the leftovers. Nobody wants that. Like, why is, are they, are they about to expire? Like, why is that shelf so picked over? Right. And so it's this, unless, and again, there are strategies here from the retail side. You can make it, get the last one, like the exclusive, like limited batch, right? There are ways that we can counter this, but it's as that buyer, you're in, especially with perishables, you are in this constant state of wanting to have just enough on the shelf and balancing that. Yeah. Okay. But I messed it up that first Thanksgiving. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's okay.
Learn, I suppose.
Exactly. Yeah. But so what's really interesting here, and I think we were talking about, are retailers more willing? Are they willing or not to work directly with small brands? Right. And we see,
because Whole Foods led the way in doing this, right? Like that was the thing. Yeah.
Yes. And so we call it working direct, because you're not going through a broker and you're not going through a distributor. But what you've got to know here is that with each direct brand, that's literally another phone call that buyer has to make, another email that buyer has to send, another physical delivery that the inventory manager needs to receive and sign in and all of that. Right. And so if we're in this industry where margins are so low, we think about streamlining.
Yeah, I mean, all those things cost
operations,
money, right? Like
all of those things cost money. I used to spend about 20 hours a week placing direct orders when I was a buyer. And it was just phone call. And so if you are a brand who is building a strategy based off going direct, right? That's the way the numbers work for you. And you really value those relationships. It is even more important that you present as a professional, respectful, prepared brand, organized brand, so that buyer thinks it's worth it for them to spend the time to order direct, and that you're not going to be a high maintenance vendor.
Because they're taking a risk on you.
Because they're taking a risk. Yeah. And, we haven't talked about this yet, but I think it's really important to address the real reason why buyers bring in products to their shelves in the first place.
Yeah. I was just about to ask, what's their motivation, right?
Yeah. So we've kind of talked around this, but when buyers bring in products for their shelves, it is to help them meet a financial goal in your category. So that is typically to increase sales or increase margin. So a buyer's performance is always, 99% of the time, evaluated based on the financial health of the categories that they manage. Okay. So a category, let's be clear, a category is any grouping of product. So it could be the pickles category, the salty snacks category, the confections category, right? So products go together. Right. And when you are in a category, you are evaluated based in comparison to all of the other brands in your category. So how are your sales compared to the pickle brand next to you? How is your margin compared to the pickle brand next to you? Yeah. So when that buyer says yes to a new product line for their shelves, it is with the hope that your product helps them meet their financial goals. Right. So the key thing here, there's two things to realize. One, your product not only has to sell well, has to meet the average velocity of that category, but for it to be worth that buyer to bring in your product line, you have to exceed existing sales of something else on the shelf. Right? Because let's say I've got a cold brew coffee brand and I'm pitching it and I want to take the place of Grady's cold brew on the shelf. I have to, in order for it to be worth it, for that buyer to take all the time and energy to bring in my product line, I have to outpace Grady's cold brew coffee sales.
Okay. So, I mean, I run a consumer insights company, right? And so sometimes we talk to small brands and they think like, well, if I actually can prove consumers like it more, then the buyer will. Maybe that's true. I've never actually asked the question whether or not that's true. I frankly think they don't do it as much as they could potentially do that. But even if the consumer likes it more, you have to figure out a way to convince the consumer to switch, which is even the harder thing to do.
Oh my gosh. Changing consumer behavior is so challenging and so expensive, right? It is really, really hard to do, which again goes back to this idea that it is easier to do regionally when you are there in person doing that demo and saying, hi, I'm Allie. This is my cold brew coffee company. Give it a shot, right? Like having that, that's the advantage that a small brand has, that like personal connection that, that huge Coca-Cola owned cold brew company is not sending.
Yeah, because these big brands, they launch line extensions and then people say, oh yeah, I'd purchase it again, and they don't. They don't do that.
Yeah. Right? So that's really important to know from the buyer's perspective, why they bring in new products in the first place. And, on the same, the other side of that same coin is this idea that so often I see brands start their wholesale pitches, start the sales pitches with something along the lines of, I'm Allie and I make the most delicious cold brew ever.
Yep.
Right. Or like, it's so tasty. It's local. It's sustainable. We work direct with these coffee farmers, like all of these things, all of these subjective attributes. Taste is subjective.
Right.
All of these things that the wholesale buyer ultimately does not care about. Right. What they care about is your product going to sell off the shelf? And so one of the big switches that we have folks make inside of Retail Ready is being really aware that the way they sell their products, the way they talk about their products and sell their products direct to consumer does not work when they pitch to wholesale buyers.
Okay.
Direct to consumer, talk about taste, talk about being a BIPOC founded brand, talk about being women owned, talk about being local, like love it. Great. When you're pitching to the wholesale buyer, you want to talk about the financial wins that you are bringing to that category. And that's where data comes in.
How will they know how to compare? How will they know how to compare that? Well, they can say, well, people prefer our product. So, once you get them to try it, they're going to come back. Yep. But they don't know what the margin of their competitor is.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So there's a couple things. One, you just ask the buyer.
Okay.
And I feel like this is something that brands are scared to do, right? Yeah. Again, it goes back to this idea that the buyer's a gatekeeper, or it's me versus them, or like, any of those things. Yeah. But I would love it when I was a buyer. I would love it if brands came to me and part of the sales conversation was, hey, we can offer you 41% margin.
Yeah.
And is that enough for you to consider us for your shelves?
Okay.
Right. And that buyer might say, actually, like, I really need 42%.
Right.
Great. We just negotiated and we came to an agreement.
Yep.
And so it can be as simple as asking the buyer, right?
Yep.
So that's
how do you know they're telling the truth, by the way? How do you know that the buyers, they have every incentive to not tell the truth.
Yes.
The truth.
Yeah, exactly. So everything's negotiable, right? So I'm like, okay, no, I need 42%.
Yeah.
And again, this is what we practice in Retail Ready. I'm sorry, 42% doesn't work for me as a brand. 41 is my final offer, but here's what I can do instead. I can do quarterly demos. I can provide the cold brew coffee for your staff, all staff meeting next month. I can write 3 recipes for your summer blog on cold brew cocktails. Here are the things that I can do. And again, this is where a small brand really has an advantage. Yep. Here are the things that I can do to how should I say this? I can't do the margin, but here's what I can do instead. Right. And again, this goes back to this idea that we feel so strongly about. that like, there is not one path to success here.
Right.
That you've got to figure out what are the non-negotiables for your own brand. Maybe 41% margin is that non-negotiable for you. You cannot go past it.
Right.
But here are the things that you are willing to say yes to instead.
Yeah.
Personalized,
personalized touch.
Exactly.
Right?
And so, that buyer is likely, I don't want to say lying to you, but they are negotiating with you. So they're going to push back and say, like, you've got to do this thing. Like, we want a free fill for, we're a small chain. We want a free fill for our 4 locations.
Right.
And again,
and a free fill is like, I give you the case for free and then you never order anything again. Is that how it works?
You do.
Like
the goal is that they order again. The goal is that they order again. Right.
Yeah.
But here's the thing that people don't know, that a free fill is when you give 1 case of each SKU for free.
Yeah.
Right. So let's say your case cost is $100 and that store is bringing in 3 SKUs of yours. So that's $300 per store.
Right.
And I just agreed to do it at 4 stores. So that's $1,200 of product that I have just decided to give that store to get on the shelf.
That doesn't seem like a lot, I have to tell you.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the brand, right? Like, I mean, this is my example of like a 4-store location. But if you're doing this, let's say Target, and you're doing it for, a region or something, or like, and you're doing it Target for 100 stores.
But Target's not even going to ask you to do that, I would presume. You tell me it differently.
Oh, yeah,
unless they think that your product has real potential, in which case you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to do this, right?
Well, you're going to do it if you can afford it.
Okay.
Right. And so like, if we're doing, I'm like, where's my calculator? If we're doing let's say we're going to do it at 100 stores.
Right.
Right. So that's
$10,000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's $120K.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Because you have 4 SKUs. Okay.
Because we've got 4 SKUs. And so all of a sudden we're looking at $120,000 of cost, right? Like, but this isn't even the retail
you're never going to
price,
get anything for.
that you are never getting anything back from.
Yeah. And if you have a 40% margin, you've got to sell more than twice that to even make that money back.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly. And here's the thing, that if you do this, which is like just a negotiating tactic, right? And so like, again, you can say yes or no. There are ways to say no. If you do this, it's important to realize that free fill, that like cost saving, is not passed along to the consumer. It's not like that product is then put on shelf at a reduced price to drive trial. That is just padded margin for that grocery buyer. Right. And so again, this is why it's so important to realize the true cost of business here. Yep. Again, establishing your non-negotiables, what you are going to say yes to or no to, and realizing how much time it's going to take to make that investment back.
Presumably the grocery buyer is using that as a tactic to also get their margin percentage up and things like that.
100%. 100%. Or like we did this, I'll admit I did this when we opened Buy Right to Viz. So that, we had so many expenses of opening a new store. Right. Our cash was going out the window. Yeah. And I did it so that we had more margin in my department to play around with. We also negotiated things like longer payment terms. Right. So usually with small brands, they want net 30, but when we first opened that new location, I negotiated, net 90 with the small brands. We were like net 6 months with some of those larger ones, just so that we could get our cash flow going before we had to start paying vendors. And so then on the other, the vendor side, it's important to realize how long it's going to take for you to get paid. Right. You drop off that order. You drop off that order and you don't get paid for 90 days. How are you going to manage your cash flow so that you can afford that next co-packing run in time to fulfill the next orders that are coming in? It's a really, it's a dance.
Yeah. Well, I can say that I think that if you're a small food brand, it definitely makes sense to educate yourself on this, and you can avoid a lot of pitfalls and a lot of probably just a lot of feeling around in the dark and not getting it right in the first instance, right?
Exactly. Wasted time and money.
Yeah. Listen, this has been super illuminating. I think we could go on forever because I do think it's a very interesting and complex topic. You're almost making me want to start a food brand because this seems like the key thing, right? Like we talk to a lot of smaller food companies, that approach us also about helping them with sensory and things.
Yeah.
And they're very fixated on their food, on their product, on their ingredient, on the benefits of that. And I think that that's great. Of course, they're passionate about it. But then there's a guy that's an advisor to us in the ingredient industry. He says, like, yeah, but they've never sold a kilo because, like, in the ingredient industry, you sell it by the kilo, right?
Yes.
And it's like, what are you going to sell is the question. Yeah. And I think what I consistently observe is that they don't either have the time or the respect early on in their product development to start thinking about how am I going to get on the shelf, because you can't learn this stuff overnight. Right.
No, exactly. You spend all your energy, all your passion developing your product, which is great. Like, we need tasty, functional products, but then there's very little left, time, energy, resources, money to get on the shelf and sell through once you're there.
Yeah. And of course, they think that the product will sell itself in a way, but I think the competition out there is just fiercely numerous. That's the thing.
Yeah, we have a whole module in Retail Ready that's if you build it, they will come is the worst business advice out there, because there's no such thing as that, right? Like you'll build it and then it's just going to sit in your warehouse.
Yeah. One last question, like, do you ever find that it's a viable tactic for new founders of food businesses to go try to speak to retail buyers before they even develop their product? Because I would think that there's a lot of knowledge out there about what is lacking in the market and what they see as important, right?
Yeah. So I get this question a lot, and it's a hard one to answer because on a very basic level, I'll say that buyers don't have time for that.
Yeah.
They are pulled in a million different directions.
Well, maybe one friend, I suppose.
Right, exactly. So, and even more so, like with supply chain issues and staffing issues, and in the past couple of years, we've just seen many players in our industry just get like run ragged, right? So, oftentimes buyers just don't give you the time of day. When I left Buy-Right, I can confidently say I was the only grocery buyer out there who was an open book ready to tell brands how it went down. We've seen more and more buyers like getting out of the industry or getting out of their roles and doing more consulting and such. But it's hard to find a buyer that will give you the time of day. So but it is valuable. Right? Mm-hmm. Like it is so valuable to get those buyer insights before you spend all of your resources in product development or all of your time trying to figure out like what's going to work on the shelf. So find a buyer who will talk to you. Yeah. That's great. But it's definitely that seems to be one of the reasons why people join us in Retail Ready, because they actually have a buyer who's an open book.
Okay, great. Well, I'm definitely going to put some information on the end of this about where people can find you. Where can people find you? What is your website?
Yeah, so it's foodbizwiz.com.
Okay, great. I'll also be able to do an introduction, and then we'll put the information on the post, because I definitely think that when I learned about what you're doing, I thought it was like, this is a very cool and elegant way to reach what is hard to reach, like the long tail of the industry. I think that's also commendable, right? It's easy to focus on the big ones because they can pay you. But then when you start focusing on small need cases, it's also work, each one of them. And so figuring out a way to reach multiples at the same time is a challenge, right? So
thank you. I appreciate that. This was fun. Great.
Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.